We got a couple announcements to get things started off tonight. So if you want to get a pencil and a piece of paper out. Concerning the Contra aid vote, which is most likely going through Congress in the next couple of weeks, there's going to be a pre-vote vigil in Montpelier. Anybody interested in taking part in that? A carpool will leave from Royal Tyler at 4:45 on April 14th. So that's for a vigil the night of the Contra aid vote in DC. To prepare for an action or a demonstration, if the Contra aid actually goes through, there will be an organizational meeting on Wednesday, April 9th at 5 o'clock in the Union of Concerned Students office in Billings. Okay, am I coming through to everybody? Is this, everybody can hear? Okay, also there will be this Friday a Freedom March protesting racism and injustice from Central America to South Africa to UVM. That will start with a rally in front of the Royal Tyler Theater at 2 o'clock this Friday. And Michael Parenti will be speaking at that rally as well as tonight. And Michael will also be speaking on tomorrow at 4:30 in Memorial Lounge in Waterman. The topic of that talk will be the role of the university in capitalist North America. Women's Organization and Referral Center will be holding an open house in Living Learning Fireplace Lounge at 6 o'clock this Sunday. That's in LNL. Any other announcements that people think need to be made? No? Okay, it's really exciting for me to introduce Michael. I was chosen to do this by the members of Spark because I'm a Parentiologist of sorts. I've been hearing about this fellow Michael Parenti for years, and I've been reading his books, which include Power and the Powerless, Democracy for the Few, and most recently, Inventing Reality, the Politics of the Mass Media, as well as many of his other articles, which have appeared in a lot of publications. And most recently, I've written a couple of papers and articles on the history of the purged professors for political reasons at UVM. Michael received his doctorate from Yale and has taught, albeit briefly for obvious reasons, at Yale, University of Illinois, at Champaign-Urbana, UVM, and at Brooklyn College. During his time at UVM in 1970 through 72, Michael was an outspoken leader of the anti-war movement. This activism naturally led to an opposition to the oppressive and undemocratic nature of the university itself. He's often described as one of the best qualified and certainly one of the most popular teachers ever at UVM. The popularity of his radical analysis, however, upset the trustees who fired him in 1972 over the opposition of the entire UVM community, including the administration. Until recently, this blacklisting has forced Michael to support himself through public lectures and through his publications. Michael Parenti represents a huge gap in our education. He and the other purged professors represent the radical analysis of our society, which the trustees feel is too dangerous for us to hear. Many who have heard him and read his books speak of the profound effect that he has had upon them in forcing people to question the power structures within our society and to question the power relationships within our society. This is why Michael is a dangerous man, and this is why he had to be removed from the university. Would you please welcome Michael Parenti?
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. The last time I saw myself described as a dangerous man was in my FBI file. So I don't look dangerous, do I? Who said yes? Just ate at one of the local restaurants, and there's a lot of salt in the food, and more than I'm used to, so I've got all this thirst. So if I keep drinking that water, don't be too distracted by it. I want to begin by talking about wealth and power. What is wealth? Anybody thought about that? What is it and where does it come from? I would argue that there are two sources to wealth. Namely, the source of wealth is from our natural resources, sun, the land, which produces crops and all that. And the second source of wealth is the labor that goes into producing those things. That's what creates wealth, you see. The thing that, for instance, transforms a tree, which is a worthless object in terms of market, not ecologically, but in terms of market and wealth, the thing that transforms a tree into a lectern or a chair or a book or paper, whatever else, is the labor that goes into harvesting the timber and producing it and turning it into furniture and all that sort of thing. What we have in our society is a system called capitalism, whereby the wealth that you create with your labor, be it physical or mental labor, is expropriated from you, and you are paid back but a portion of the wealth you create. That's the only way that I can make money off your labor. It's by paying you back less than the value you create. By paying for all the various commodities of production, but there's one commodity of production that's rather unique, and that's not the raw materials, and it's not the fuel, it's not that. It's your labor, which also is a commodity. Because that labor will create a value greater than itself. It doesn't consume itself in its entirety. That labor power gives me the chance to then sell these commodities at a greater price than what I pay you. From this, the capitalist accumulates vast stores of money. There's only one reason you are hired to work for the capitalist, and that is because he can make money off your labor. Let me give you a quote that comes out of, this is called Preparation, which I should have had this located earlier, but I didn't think of. It's from a full-page ad that was in the Christian Science Monitor a few years ago. And it said, "What will capital be doing on Labor Day?" Labor Day is when, you know, everybody gets off. Working, building new plants, starting new businesses, funding innovation and growth, developing more energy to fuel the economy. Part of the capital that creates jobs comes from the earnings of American industry. Throughout the economy, stronger earnings can provide the capital to create more and better jobs, etc. So as we celebrate Labor Day, let's not forget capital. It works too. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to maintain that that's a lie. That is an inversion of reality. Capital doesn't work. Capital doesn't produce anything. It is the thing that is produced by labor. You could have all the capital in the world, you could be as rich as Nelson Rockefeller, and you could not produce this building, nor this little microphone, or this little light bulb. Only human labor can produce those things. The message we get is that capital creates rather than is created. And that's the message that's given again and again. This is not to say that only physical labor creates wealth. There are managers, and they do important things, and planners and all that sort of thing. But those people aren't the capitalists. The person who makes the profits is a person who doesn't work. Profits are the thing you make by not working. People always say to me, "Well, aren't you a capitalist then? Look at the profits you make on your books." No, but I worked. I wrote my books. I sat there hours, 10 hours a day for over a year to write Democracy for the Few, killing myself, doing Canadian Air Force exercises to keep my body from falling apart. I worked. That was my labor that went into that book. And the copy editor who went over that manuscript, he works and puts his labor into it, or her labor into it. And the printers who put that book together, and the advertisers do the advertising copy, and the salesmen who go out and visit the professors and say, "Hey, adopt this book for your course," they are all putting their labor into that book. The man who makes profits on my book, the capitalist, is the former Prime Minister of England, Harold Macmillan, because the Macmillan family owns St. Martin's Press. And Macmillan puts no labor into that book, but he makes more per copy than I do. The author might get anywhere from 7 to 10% 15% on the book. Macmillan gets much more. He gets 20 to 25%, and he does no work. You see, he can then use the money that he gathers from the labor of all these other people, the printers, the copy editors, the authors, and all that, and he can go out and become a statesman and rule England and set down laws as to what is right and proper for the protection of property, such. I saw Macmillan on TV a few years back. He was on the Dick Cavett show, you know, and Dick Cavett was saying to him, "Oh, Mr. Macmillan, now that you're, golly, now that you're no longer Prime Minister, what do you do to sustain yourself, support yourself?" And he said, "Well, the family has a little publishing house which does quite well, thank you." You know, and I'm sitting there going, "Idiots!" When they take your money, that you worked for, when they take your money as a worker, when they take your money as a taxpayer, when they cut out that big chunk from your check, when you come home and see that check and say, there must be some mistake, and then you realize there isn't, that they took off for this and this and this because they got to pay for those missiles and those guns, they're not taking your money, they're taking your life. That's your life you put in there. That's your life, your blood, your energy, your brains that you put in there. They are stealing from your life when they do that. And when they accumulate their millions and their billions and their trillions, and then they take your taxes to safeguard and support their investments in other countries, so they can then steal your jobs from you and close down your factories here because you've worked and organized and fought back and you've gotten your wages up to $5 or $6 or $10 an hour, and they can close that factory and open it up in Korea and get a Korean farm girl into that factory, into that textile mill, and work her for 18 cents an hour, 12 hours a day for 7 days a week. They're stealing it from you. They're stealing it from them. They're victimizing then the people of both countries. 18 cents an hour, 12-hour day, 7 days a week. You work a double shift, 24 hours if you want to get a day off to go see your family back on the farm. That was a story written up about the plight of the Korean farm girls. That's why we're in El Salvador, and that's why we're in Nicaragua, and that's why we're in South Korea and everywhere else. It's not to make the world safe for democracy, it's to make the world safe for hypocrisy. If Ronald Reagan is against the Nicaraguans because they're not democratic, and it's undemocratic regimes he doesn't like, then why doesn't he invade Chile? Why doesn't he invade South Africa? Instead, he's been in bed with these countries. He gives them aid. This is what we're talking about. Now, that ruling class, which owns the land, the labor, the technology, and the science, and the natural resources of our country, that ruling class never stands naked with its wealth and power. It cloaks that wealth, it wraps the flag around it, it sets up a whole ethos, it talks about how this is the right or natural condition of things. In other words, it seeks to control not only the material environment, but also the symbolic environment. And one of the ways it does that is through its control of the U.S. news media. The mass media, ladies and gentlemen, if you want to discuss whether they're free and independent, let's discuss, first of all, who they belong to. Because he who pays the piper calls the tune. And what I found in my investigation of the mass media is that, in fact, the media may be free and independent, but they're owned by the giant corporations. They are themselves giant corporations. CBS Incorporated is a multinational conglomerate. Time Incorporated is a multinational conglomerate. It owns about 20 or so national and regional magazines and newspapers. It owns radio stations and TV stations. It owns timberland and paper mills. It owns recreational parks and publishing houses. It owns furniture stores. It owns all sorts of things. So the media are not merely friendly toward the corporate world, they are part of it. I mean, they are corporations. The largest stockholder of NBC is Chase Manhattan Bank. The largest stockholder of CBS is Chase Manhattan Bank. The largest stockholder of ABC is Morgan Guaranty. And Chase Manhattan is third largest stockholder of ABC. And the other large stockholders are First National, Citibank, Bank of America. Their offices sit on the boards of education. I'm really tired. I've been flying all day up from Florida, grueling 2 days down there. Actually, I was lecturing at the University of Northern Florida, but traveling kind of wastes my mind. Their representatives sit on the boards of directors of these major networks, and they decide all fiduciary policy, and they pick the executive offices of the networks, who in turn pick the line offices and the staff offices and the producers and the corporate presidents, who in turn pick the station managers and so forth and so on, program managers and so forth. So the mass media are part of corporate America. Very much like the rich and successful businessmen sit on the boards of directors of our universities, our foundations, our museums, our science establishments, our churches in many cases, and various other of our institutions. It was a group of rich conservative businessmen who decided that you could not hear me speak. I mean, could not hear me teach. And decided the same about a number of others, even though the entire university community here, my department unanimously, the faculty senate on tenure and renewal unanimously, the council of deans unanimously, the president and vice president of the university all voted to renew my contract. This rich board of trustees, this group of businessmen, by 15-4, I see the little flyer, I'd forgotten what the vote was, 15-4 said, no, we don't want him. And the reason was one which they kept to themselves. I mean, really, it was their political prejudice and their class perspective that was operative. That class perspective is in the media also. There are stories that just don't appear in the media. They continually get suppressed. I'll give you one, and I'll make you agree with me, and I'll make you believe it's true, because you know it's true. The story of the suppression, the brutal exploitation, the death squads, the unspeakable and limitless corruption of the Marcos regime in the Philippines. Ladies and gentlemen, that story was suppressed. For 20 years, you did not hear about it. For 20 years, us oddballs on the left, us extremists, were saying that Marcos was a thug. For 20 years, American leaders were kissing and hugging him and saying he was a protector of democracy. And you saw the clipping on TV not long ago of George Bush hugging him and saying, a friend of democracy, Marcos. For 20 years. For 6 years, you had Ronald Reagan hugging and kissing Marcos, you know. And then when they finally decided that Marcos was a liability, when these dictators and thugs, whose purpose is to keep their people in tow so that multinationals can go in there and in fact exploit that labor and employ people at 80 cents an hour and 56 cents an hour, which is the average wage in the Philippines, and turn their people into beggars and prostitutes, which happens to be one of the biggest industries in the Philippines. It is the world's leading producer of child prostitutes, ahead of even Hong Kong. And in return, they collect boodles from the U.S. government and from the multinationals and throw the country open to those corporations and say, here it is, boys, cheap labor, no occupational safety to worry about, no environmental protections to worry about. This is the capitalist dream. Your profit of margin will be 5 and 10 times for the dollar invested than what it is in the U.S. And those corporations go there. And when they come to you and say, we got to close down because we just don't have the market. And when General Motors comes to you and says, we're closing down our factories in Detroit, The part they don't tell you is that in the last 10 years, they've opened up they've built a dozen new factories in other countries, in countries like the Philippines. And that story doesn't get in the U.S. media. That is consistently and deliberately suppressed until one day it becomes evident that Marcos is so corrupt, so rotten, so inefficient, that instead of being the purveyor of what they call euphemistically stability, he is himself becoming an object of instability. That the hatred for him is developing, and the momentum against him is such that all classes are joining together in what is looking like a revolutionary development. So the boys in Washington sit there and they say, we saw what happened with the Shah. We hugged and kissed the Shah for 25 years. You know, I thought the Shah was everything I used to read about the Shah, the great modernizer of Iran, and I used to listen to, I had Iranian graduate students at Cornell when I taught there. They hated him. They would sit and talk and they would snarl about the Shah. These were kids from well-to-do families, too. And they would tell you stories about how their brother, when they got back to Tehran airport, disappeared. Just 2 police would come pick him up and they never heard from him again. How his sister was raped and tortured and they found her, she was like a basket case or this and that. They would tell you story after story about this guy, the Shah. And I said, I don't think we're getting the whole story about the Shah of Iran. I mean, what's going on? And then one day, as if something happened, a revolution came. And so the boys in Washington are saying, I think we got ourselves another Shah. I think we got ourselves another Somoza. He is becoming such an object of instability and destability. He's becoming so corrupt, so obviously repressive. He's ripping off so much boodle that the people are getting so angry at him that he's losing any kind of base or appearance of power. And there may be a revolutionary upheaval. We'll be faced with a revolution in the Philippines. And in fact, there is a revolution going on, the New People's Army. So what we've got to do is get rid of him and get a fresh face. We've got to get a Duarte in there. We've got to get somebody who's going to give a cosmetic front and make a few little reforms and set the thing up and keep the class structure and the multinational corporate structure in. Because what we care about is not democracy, elections, no elections. They'll go for elections when it looks like it'll legitimate their rule, or they will suppress elections, as in Chile under Allende, as in Guatemala under Arbenz, as in Iran under Mossadegh when they overthrew Mossadegh and put in the Shah, as in Brazil under Goulart when they brought in the generals, as in Argentina when they brought in the generals who then proceeded to kill 15,000 people. And they will destroy elections, or they'll go for elections if it looks like it gives the appearance of democracy, as in El Salvador, where you had a choice of a fascist like Debusson or an apologist for the fascists like Duarte, with all parties to the left of them being outlawed. So we go for an election, and that election was held this past a few months ago at the behest of the U.S. State Department and the CIA, with the understanding that Aquino would probably win it, and that you'd have this fresh transition, that would be that. But something happened on the way to the polls, and that is Marcos did the same old thing. Well, what happened is the U.S. media now reported it, because that was now the policy of the multinationals. That was now the policy of the Rockefellers, the Morgans, the DuPonts, and the Mellons. That was now the policy of Ronald Reagan, although he waffled back and forth, because as a right-winger, his heart was with Ferdinand Marcos. And by the way, all through that election, right to last month, the right wing in America was supporting Marcos. I know, I was talking to them down in Miami. I was talking to the Christian Broadcasting Network. They love Ferdinand Marcos, and they said, this Aquino woman, she's probably a communist, so forth, so on. And Reagan himself waffled. You remember after the election, it was so corrupt, he got up and said, it was a fair election. There were irregularities on both sides. It's a two-party system. Let's keep them. And the boys got to him again and said, look, Ronnie, we got this guy's a lie. It's an albatross. We've got to get rid of him. We had a whole election. It's all been televised now, and you got to really, it doesn't look good at all. So then I see an astonishing thing. I'm sitting there and I'm watching NBC Evening News, and I hear the announcer with all that authoritative, objective, neutral intonation, that all-knowing voice. You know the voices they have, those announcers, they have a whole set of phrases they could say. And nobody can say for sure, which means I don't know, right? And they give you all these insightful things like, unless this bill gets through Congress soon, it may have an ill fate, or it may meet an early demise. Or if things continue this way, we may be facing a lot of turmoil. I mean, really profound stuff. You know, these truisms. You know, if the voter interest is as heavy as it seems, there's going to be a big turnout. Unless that kind of stuff. You know. So there was NBC, and they were saying, this election in the Philippines has been marred by corruption and violence, as every election under President Marcos has been. And I almost came off my chair. I said, as every election has been? Then why haven't we heard it about all those other elections? Why was that never mentioned? Why was he portrayed in the media the way the U.S. government wanted him portrayed, the way his multinational corporate pals wanted him portrayed? So I just demonstrated to you a story that has been suppressed. You can tell they're liars, you can get proof that they're liars when they're forced finally to say the truth. And then you say, not only forced to say the truth, but say they knew the truth all along. That's what NBC was saying. That last phrase was remarkable. They were saying, we knew the truth all along, that this guy was corrupt, to the tune of $6 to $10 billion. That he scooped out of the country, took it out. Isn't it nice to know where your tax money is going? Into shoes, into 3,000 pairs of them. Now, when you talk to journalists fall into two groups. There are those who will say to you, yeah, we're censored all the time. It's a problem. There are journalists who worry. They worry about getting their copy cut. They worry about getting their copy rewritten. They worry about stories getting killed. When friends of mine were in Nicaragua, they met a number of American journalists who talked about their frustrations. They said, our stories don't get run. They don't get printed. If we say anything positive that the government's doing, feeding the people, building health clinics, this sort of thing, this stuff isn't news. It doesn't get into the U.S. press. You can't say that about the Sandinistas. They worry about getting passed over for promotions. They worry about getting reassigned. Ray Bonner, when he exposed what those great defenders of freedom in El Salvador were doing, the Salvadorian death squads, the Salvadorian army, when he gave that description of the El Moros massacres, you know, and we went in and talked about the degree of slaughter and assassination, what did the New York Times do? How did they reward him? They pulled him off the story and stuck him on the financial pages. And that has a cooling and chilling effect on the other reporters. After a while, they've got to report what their editors want to hear. And reporters will tell you that people are very finely tuned as to how far they can go and what they can say and not say. And that, and if they cross that line, there'll be a call from upstairs. And throughout my book, Inventing Reality, here's the commercial. In this book, Inventing Reality, I have instances after instances where you have publishers calling and say, don't print that. Killed that story. I don't want this. Generally, you don't have to do that because what you usually do is you pick an editor who already agrees with you. If you have to keep censoring your editor day after day, you fire him. That's not why you hired the man. You hired someone when Sulzberger took over the New York Times from his old man. He brought in Abe Rosenthal as managing editor of the New York Times. And I talked to a Times editor who says, I can't imagine, and he said, look at this chart. It's pretty much from the top down. It looks to me like the U.S. Army. I said to him, publisher, managing editor, editors, desk, journalists. Looks like what you call your basic hierarchy, command, your basic university, anything, Army. And this editor said, it doesn't operate like that on the chart. No self-respecting managing editor would have a publisher leaning over his neck telling him what to put on the front page of the paper. Abe Rosenthal would quit tomorrow if that happened. I would quit if I were being told. But the point that he was missing very conveniently is that Sulzberger doesn't have to stand over Rosenthal's shoulder. The reason he picked Rosenthal is because he knew that that was the kind of product he would turn out. And when Rosenthal came in, he announced that the New York Times had gotten too far into advocacy journalism, and it's my purpose to bring it further to the right. He said further to the center. But Rosenthal's center happens to be a neoconservative center. He happens to be a right-winger himself. And when that editor himself was transferred because of advocacy journalism, he didn't quit, by the way, and I won't mention his name. There's another set of journalists who get very angry if you insinuate that they're not their own person, you know. Are you saying to me that I'm not free to say what I want or write what I want? Is that what you're trying to say to me? I'll have you know that in 15 years of journalism, I have always said what I like. And I answer, you say what you like because they like what you say. And should you ever move beyond that, should you ever move and the leash and feel the tug of leash, then you'll feel the tug of leash if you move beyond that. Ideologically, of course, if your view and worldview is that of your newspaper, then you will not feel any kind of conflict. It will be quite ego-syntonic, or ideologically syntonic, if you will. The effect of a media which in effect propagates the business perspective or has a class perspective, even though it never labels it that, is to short-circuit the democratic process. It means that we can have tens and hundreds of thousands of people demonstrating over issues, and these issues are then downplayed. I have a whole section in here on the way protest and dissent is reported in the media. Generally, it's trivialized. Protesters are looked like screwballs, or they're out there working on their suntans or with their cameras or smoking pot, and they're kind of out for a frolic. I have descriptions in the Washington Post and New York Times how they describe marches, U.S. out of Central America, whatever else. Trivialize it, minimalize it, marginalize it. Generally, the democratic process is short-circuited because there's a whole host of opinions which people have which do not get registered, which normally would act upon our elected representatives and which would create the climate of opinion in which policy is made, but which often do not. And one of the things I discovered in this research is that the media do not always control our opinion. That while the bulk of the business-owned media in this country reflects the positions of the powers that be, and that includes the White House and the State Department, the bulk of the American people, by every measurement of opinion polls, are going a different direction. The American people want more environmental protection. Ronald Reagan is moving toward less environmental protection, so is Congress. The American people want out of Central America by 75, 80%. Overwhelming majorities, 3-to-1, 4-to-1, out of Central America. Ronald Reagan's getting us into Central America, and Congress is sitting there saying, well, we didn't give them 100 million, but we have to give them something, don't we? Those Democratic senators and congressmen who so worry about being soft and wimpy on communism are nothing but wimps in relation to Ronald Reagan. That's where they come across. If they worry about being wimps, why don't they stop acting like wimps? The American people do not want aid to El Salvador, to that government. They don't see their interest there, and yet aid is going to El Salvador. The American people want a nuclear freeze that Reagan has opposed, a bilateral, mutually verifiable nuclear freeze. One which, by the way, has been passed by the Supreme Soviet unanimously, and one which was passed by the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. A nuclear freeze, verifiable, bilateral, mutual nuclear freeze, virtually identical to the one which was voted and passed by scores of townships here in Vermont and by 9 states in the Union and by hundreds of other townships throughout the country. But the U.S. government has resisted and opposed any nuclear freeze, weapons freeze, that is. So on issue after issue, you find, well, ownership may translate into propaganda, but propaganda doesn't seem to translate into indoctrination. Or if it does not translate into support at the policy level. That is, you might have Americans feeling just generally, well, the Sandinistas are some bad guys, because that's all they've been hearing. they're a bad group, but they still do not see what's in their interest to have to spend their tax money and send their sons off to Central America to fight these Sandinistas. So what the media do is they really don't always influence us in how we think. But they do influence in what we, if not in what we think, in what we think about. They set the agenda. They create an opinion visibility. And in that sense, they short-circuit the democratic process. Because what Congress responds to is not actual opinion, they respond to the opinion visibility. So not one of those wimps will get up and have a word to say about the Sandinistas. Not one of them will get up. I shouldn't say not one of them. In fact, there are a number of progressives in Congress who do take a stance that's different. The Black Caucus and a few others, but they're a very small group. But most of them will not get up and say, maybe we shouldn't attack the Nicaraguans, not only because it would be a loss of American lives, not only because it isn't a workable policy, but also because it's unjust and immoral. That maybe they're doing some good things for their country, that they're building these health clinics and they've got these land cooperatives going. And for the first time, the people can go to school. And for the first time, the people can see a doctor. And for the first time, every Nicaraguan, whatever the shortages and whatever the hardships, every one of them gets a ration of beans and rice. And every kid in Nicaragua has got food. And for the first time in Nicaragua, despite earthquake, despite Somoza's plundering, despite civil war, despite foreign invasion and the Contra destruction, despite all that, Nicaragua today has the lowest infant mortality rate in Central America, lower even than Costa Rica's. Why don't they get up and say that? They don't say that because the media doesn't say it, and they would sound odd and strange if they said it coming out of nowhere, you see. This gets you back to what Alvin Gould called the background assumptions. That often the persuasiveness of any datum is determined not by the information that's in that datum or the logic of it or the argument made, but by how congruent it is with the background assumptions that you've been fed or that buttress that make you define reality, that make you then see this data as something true or not true. And what the media do through that everyday ideological pounding is create a background assumption that short-circuits the democratic dialogue that we keep trying to create. The function of that media also is to support the two-party monopoly. If you ever notice in an election, the mass news media give an average of 10 to 15 minutes every night, primetime news time, to the major two-party candidates, the Democrats and the Republicans. And third-party minority candidates get absolutely no time. Or over a 6-month period, they might get 1 minute. Not 1 minute a night, but 1 minute. You know, a minute to say, oh, and so-and-so of the far something party is running. Isn't he odd or strange? You know, kind of parade him out as the exotic. Well, what do you want? I mean, we have to give national time to the Socialist Worker Party or the Communist Party or parties that the American people, after all, aren't interested in, that have only a little group that don't have a national name, a candidate who doesn't have a national name. Why should we? Well, let me tell you something. There's only one way you get a national name, and that's by exposure on the national media. So it's a catch-22. Let me tell you something else. There are all sorts of politicians who don't have a national name who are immediately given media coverage. National media coverage when they declare for president. Wilbur Mills, Reuben Askew, John Anderson, John McCloskey. They had no national following. They were all busts. They were blowouts. They went nowhere. But the media reported them as serious contenders for the nomination. Why? Because they were Republicans or Democrats. And now I'll give you candidates who do have a national name. Dr. Benjamin Spock, who sold 50 million copies of his books throughout America, who's better known than any presidential candidate coming up. When he ran for the People's Party, and he went to almost every state in the Union and shook hands and talked to groups and got on little local radio appearances and all that, he got nothing on major media. Nothing. They'd never heard of him. Barry Commoner, the great ecology author and lecturer and all that, he was always on the media until he declared as his presidency of the Citizens Party back in, what was that, 80? In 80. Then nothing. He couldn't get on the national media. He couldn't get a moment, a minute, to inform the American people that there was this candidate. The millions who knew Benjamin Spock did not know that he was running for president, even though he knocked himself out for months. The millions who knew Barry Commoner did not know he was running for president. And then one day in desperation, on a radio short, Barry Commoner got up and he said, he had a little radio blurb, 1 minute political advertisement, and he said the famous one that caused that furor. You don't remember it? Let me tell you it. It went something like this. He said, we're running a third party, a citizens party for the people. Why? Because the two major parties give us only bullshit. And the wires suddenly inflamed. Suddenly Barry Commoner was national news. ABC, NBC, CBS all came descending down upon him with their cameras, and they all, the national networks, radios, TV, and they all said to him, did you actually say? The next two ads, the ad was supposed to run 2 more times, and in fact, it was cut. The other radio stations cut it. It was on a local radio station, but they got excited. They didn't care about what he said about the environment, about military and defense policy, about taxes, about foreign policy, domestic policy, human services. They didn't care about that, but he uttered this one word, and suddenly he became the focus of a scandalized attention, at least for a few days, which proves that even if the media is not interested in the real issues, it will always, look for bullshit when they can find it and report it. The rule is there is nothing too vital, too important, that it cannot be totally ignored by the media. And there's nothing too trivial, too silly, too asinine, that it cannot be given fulsome and elaborate play. The arguments that they have limitations of time and space and they can't cover everything are a lot of baloney. Because, in fact, you have small radical magazines which will break all sorts of stories which the media won't touch. With 1,000th of the staff that the big newspapers or big networks have, you have Mother Jones, The Nation, The Progressive, The People's Daily World, In These Times, Political Affairs, running articles and analysis and breaking kinds of stories which the media somehow can never get around to doing. Regarding specifically foreign policy, I've already said some things about that. But the big point here, I think, to make is that what we have created is a climate of opinion that is favorable to a conservative background assumptions. Let me just quote what John Kenneth Galbraith said about political conservatism. Political conservatism benefits from the deep desire of politicians, Democrats in particular, for respectability. Their need to show that they are individuals of sound, confidence-inspiring judgment. And what is the test of respectability? It is, broadly, whether speech and action are consistent with the comfort and well-being of the people of property and position, the people who sit on those boards of directors or boards of regents or boards of trustees. A radical is anyone who causes discomfort or otherwise offends such interests. Thus, in our politics, we test even liberals by their conservatism. That's why you've got these guys always dressing up their right, always worrying about whether or not they're being respectable enough. So when Ronald Reagan gets up and he gives that kind of talk that he gave a week or so ago about Nicaragua, the Democrats will follow it by saying, as I say, well, we of course agree with the president, but we don't think we should go that far and do it that way. They're not worried about Nicaragua. They're not worried about the truth, and they're not worried about the interests of the American people. They're worried about the appearance of their respectability in this field of conservatism. Now, I've had reporters say to me, look, Parenti, we can't editorialize the news. You understand? We're neutral. And if the president says one thing, we put that down and we say, the president says, and if someone else says the other thing, we put that down and we can compare the two. And I say to them, look, I don't want you to inject your editorial opinions into the news. I just wrote a whole book about how you already do that and you don't even realize it. That's number one. Number two is, it's not that I want you to editorialize, nor do I want you to pretend to neutrality. I want you not to be objective, I want you to be truthful. And when the President of the United States gets up and he sets out a stream of words which at best are very one-sided interpretations and at worst are outright lies, and you just report that to the American people without the slightest hint that there might be an alternative perspective, then you're nothing but a mouthpiece for power and wealth. And that's not objectivity. What you've done is traded in your commitment to accuracy and truth for an appearance of neutrality. When the president in October 1984 gets up and he says, I'm going to support Social Security, and they put in the headlines, President Reagan in favor of Social Security. And you read this in the Washington Post on page 1, and it's written like a straight story. And you read it in the New York Times on page 1, and you hear it announced by Dan Rathers. And you sit there and you say, what am I, in little Johnny Lollipop Wonderland? What is this? And you don't mention the fact that for 20 years, this man has hated Social Security. He's gone after it with claw and fang and tooth and nail. And he equates it with welfare, which he detests and hates. And you don't even mention that. And the day after the election, he's already going after cost of living allowances and trying to squeeze it out and trim it down anyway, despite his pledges, you see. And when he gets up before the American people and he says, the Sandinistas are guilty of torture. And you don't mention that Amnesty International has gone into Nicaragua and gave them a clean bill of health and said that no prisoners are being tortured. And when he says the Sandinistas are drug runners and they take drugs and they're smuggling them into our country and all that. And his own drug enforcement agency has come out and said, no, we have no evidence of the Nicaraguan government, the Nicaraguan regime, as the media would always say, it doesn't have a government, dealing with drugs. In fact, they have a very hard line against drugs. And when he gets up and he says, the Sandinistas tried to export revolution to... I'm sounding more like Lyndon Johnson, I know. But anyway, same thing, same guy. The Sandinistas... My Richard Nixon used to be pretty good, but I can't do it anymore. He says the Sandinistas are exporting revolution to Brazil. And the Brazilian government, 3 weeks before he made that speech, 3 weeks before, the Brazilian government refuting Secretary of State George Shultz, who had first uttered that lie, and said, no, the Sandinistas are not exporting. We have no evidence that the Sandinistas are exporting revolution to our country. What we have are some guns which we think had a Nicaraguan origin, but we are satisfied as to where they came from and such, and there is no such policy, and we have no such evidence. They said that 3 weeks before, and the President of the United States, nevertheless, ignoring and suppressing the Brazilian government's announcement, reiterated that in his speech, and the media just simply reports it to you as the truth, as a definition of reality. I say, that's not neutrality. That's being a mouthpiece for power. That's being a handmaiden for power. In regard to foreign policy, these are the rules, generally. Any socialist or revolutionary government that exists, you cannot report anything positive about anything they've done. You cannot report about land reform. You cannot report about health programs. You cannot report about literacy campaigns. You cannot report about, for instance, where have you read that in Nicaragua unemployment has gone from 60% down to 15%? What you hear about is that, things are terrible, there are gasoline shortages, and people who own cars have a problem getting gas. And by the way, that's true, but how many people in a poor country like Nicaragua have cars? What's called a middle class in many of these countries is a very small and very privileged stratum. So you cannot report anything positive about any revolutionary government. That information is systematically suppressed. It is kept from your consciousness. You are not allowed to hear about that. You generally do not hear about U.S. client state brutality and torture. You do not hear about the electrode shock machines which have been set up and brought down by the CIA or the AID with people trained by American officers to torture their own people. Those stories are just simply not publicized. The stories of torture that the Shah submitted his government, his people to, were continually suppressed for 25 years. On page 22 or so, on a story after the Shah fell, I read, way back, buried in a column, a former CIA operative who said that we used Nazi techniques. The CIA took Nazi handbooks, brought it down, and trained the Savak. That was in the New York Times, but it was buried way back. It was a little paragraph, and it was remarkable. I mean, this should have been on page 1. This is one of the most morally shocking stories. And by the way, media sensationalism, don't get too much into that. One of the functions of the media is not sensational. There are a whole bunch of sensational stories that the media would never touch because they are so sensational. That is because they do operate against the interests of wealth and power. That was one of them. It peeked through in the back pages. You could find it. And there it was sitting there like that. The testimony, his name was named and all that. He had a change of heart. He said, it's horrible what's happened under the Shah. Those stories are continually suppressed. You do not know, and you are not informed of what your government does in our name to the peoples of Latin America, Asia, and Africa, in conjunction with the fascist regimes that get our aid and such. That's another incredibly unreported story. When it is reported, when it finally surfaced that the Argentine generals killed 15,000, there's no link made to U.S. policy. It'll be admitted and it'll just be said, well, there were these rotten generals who did these rotten things to their people. But no link made to the U.S. investment pattern and what the function of that is. I mean, why do they go killing people? Well, they just go out and like to kill a bunch of people? Why do they kill trade union leaders, peasant leaders, agrarian cooperative people, student leaders, intellectuals? Why do they kill certain sectors of the population more than others if they're just out bloodlusting? They kill to suppress and maintain the status quo, to make that country safe for capital investment and capital accumulation. You do not hear about the development of democracy in revolutionary countries. And democracy, by the way, is more than just voting for Tweedledee or Tweedledum. Democracy may mean people for the first time learning how to read and write. People for the first time getting up in their neighborhood committees for the defense of the revolution and voicing their opinions about how they should operate and how they should plan their resources and their rationing and how they should carry out their various health programs. People becoming the active social agents of their own life, as has happened in Cuba and Nicaragua and in the liberated zones of El Salvador. You do not hear about that democracy developing. We did not hear about that in the Nicaraguan election, there were 6 parties that ran, 3 to the left of the Sandinistas and 3 to the right of them. And that every one of those parties was given 9 million Cordobas, which is about the equivalent of $350,000 for their campaign expenses, which is $350,000 more than a minority third party in the United States would get. And that every single one of those parties got 2 free hours on television a week, broken up, I think, into segments every day, which is 2 free hours a week more than minority parties in this country get. And that every one of those parties got proportional representation. So if they won 15% of the vote, they got 15% of the seats. And if you win 15% of the vote in this country under a single-member district which favors the majority parties, you win 0% of the seats. That's 15% more seats than we get here. That was not reported. It was not reported that it was a voluntary ballot in Nicaragua, that it was a secret ballot. It was not reported that in El Salvador it was not a voluntary ballot, and that if you did not have your scheduale, as it's called, if you did not have that stamp that you had voted, you could be shot and arrested, and people were gunned down on the streets. It was not reported that the ballot was not secret in El Salvador, that when you went in, you signed your name next to a numero, 164, let's say, and then you got a ballot, and the ballot was marked 164, and you voted for what you wanted. They could trace how you voted. So if you damaged your ballot or you put a protest ballot, you crossed out both candidates, they would know and be able to trace it back to your name. That was not reported in the U.S. media. That was suppressed. You were not told that. You were told that democracy was developing in El Salvador, a U.S. encouraged democracy. By the way, I saw a documentary film of just that happening. I saw Napoleon Duarte come over and a reporter saying, "What do you call this? The ballots are numbered and your name is next to the number. What do you?" And he said, "Listen, you must respect the culture of our country. That's the way we do it here." You see, that's what he said. That was all on film. But you never saw that film. That sensational, revealing, informative film. You never saw that on Dan Rather's Tom Brokaw or Peter Jennings. Well, there's a few other things I wanted to say, but I kind of can't remember them. One of the ways they distort is not just suppression. A very common way is just the way things are framed or slanted. Let me give you one example. I got tons of them in my book, but I'll just give you this one. In 1984, the New York Times ran a news analysis story. It was headlined as follows: "What's behind Castro's softer tone?" Now the headline right there, before you got into the story, what's behind Castro's softer tone? It suggests that Castro's up to something. See, the opening sentence reads, "Once again, Fidel Castro is talking as if he wants to improve relations with the United States." You see, overtures become an object of suspect. What could this possibly be? As if he wants to improve relations. So what you do is you discredit the overture and you imply that that it isn't happening, really, in fact. Castro, explained in the New York Times, is interested in, quote, taking advantage of American trade, technology, and tourism. And he would, quote, prefer not to be spending so much time and energy on national defense. Well, that's a remarkable thing. Fidel Castro, the aggressor, Fidel Castro, who's going to conquer Florida and Georgia and march his troops right up here, right up, cut a swath, right up the Atlantic coast, right into Burlington, and dance with your sister. Fidel Castro doesn't want to spend that much on military defense. He's saying, I would like not to have aggressive, belligerent relations with you. I would like to have trade and tourism. And this is, of course, seen as, because the background assumption is of a negative, pernicious, diabolic communist, this is seen as not legitimate. Why does this communist, where does he come off wanting trade and less military defense? Where does he come off with this acting friendly stuff, you know? This seems to be a promising basis for improved relations. The guy says, look, let's have improved relations. You explore it. If he's bluffing, you call it. And if he backs off, then you can say, look, he isn't really serious, doesn't really want it. Cuba's own self-interest, Castro was saying. His self-interest, something much stronger than love. Castro isn't saying, I love you, gringos. I love Ronald Reagan. Policy is not based on love, but something much stronger. Love, as you know, comes and goes, but self-interest is always there. And his self-interest is he wants more trade. His self-interest is he should be able to deal with the United States and buy from the United States. His self-interest is that he doesn't want to have to go 16,000 miles around to Japan to buy school buses, which is where Cuba buys their school buses, from Japan. He'd like to buy them 90 miles away, or Florida, or from Detroit. His self-interest is that he'd rather buy medical supplies from the U.S. than have to buy them from Czechoslovakia or China, which is where he gets them. I know I was in the hospital when I was in Cuba, and there were Chinese bandages and Czech stuff and all that. That's his self-interest. Well, what did the Times say? How did they deal with this threat of friendliness? The Times literally made nothing of Castro's stated desire to ease tensions, and instead presented the rest of the story, the whole rest of the story, from a U.S. government perspective. It noted that, quote, most Reagan administration officials seem skeptical. The administration continues to believe that the best way to deal with the Cuban leader is with unyielding firmness. Administration officials see little advantage in wavering. Now, the article doesn't explain why they seem skeptical. What are the observable actualities that justify such skepticism? Nor does the article explain why a negative response to Castro is described as I just said, unyielding firmness. The administration is dealing with the Cuban leader with unyielding firmness. Why not call that unyielding rigidity, or hostile rigidity, or uncooperativeness or lack of friendliness? Nor does it explain why a willingness, or why a willingness to respond seriously to Castro's overtures would be labeled as wavering. You see, the administration officials see little advantage in wavering. Wavering from what? What's diplomacy about? You explore overtures, you explore areas. So in the very vocabulary in which you have to deal with, you can see how the story is loaded. What the Times did is they left an impression of a power-hungry Castro that was up to no good, who was out to take in the United States with his softer tones. That same, by the way, that same kind of framing goes on with the Soviet Union. The one thing Ronald Reagan will not take from Gorbachev is yes for an answer. Gorbachev says, I will unilaterally call a moratorium on atmospheric testing. Will you follow me, Mr. Reagan? And the Reagan administration says, they stopped testing because they did all their testing early in the year and we still have a few tests, so we've got to get ours done. So we can't listen to this. Okay, then get yours done. And then the day before their moratorium is up, you say, okay, we'll be in with you. You don't test anymore, we won't test anymore. Nothing from the White House. Gorbachev turned around and said, we are extending our unilateral moratorium on testing, our ban on testing, 3 more months. And the White House explained then to us, well, it's wintertime. They don't do much testing in the winter. Most of their testing is in the March and all that, so they don't test in December, January, February. And then in February, Gorbachev said, we're extending our ban another 3 months. And the U.S. continued to test. All the U.S. has to do is say, we won't test. But they say and said, that's not a serious offer. That's not a serious overture. What's more serious than actual doing it? There's got to be action and not just words. What's more action than banning your own testing and saying, now you don't test. As long as you don't test, we won't test. Because what Gorbachev knows is that there cannot be an escalation of nuclear weapons without nuclear testing. If you stop testing, you stop development of nuclear weapons. And Ronald Reagan knows that too. And one of them wants to stop development and the other one doesn't. One of them does not want a Star Wars and the other does. One of them does not want a neutron bomb and the other does. One of them wants to cut his ICBMs by 50% and the other one does not want to cut. And that's what it's about. But the media just goes along and says administrative officials were skeptical. And that's what we're told. There's the absence of observable actualities and analysis. Having said all this, I think I've gone too long, huh? I better stop. Having said all this, I want to add 1 or 2 other things. Namely that while it is true that we are manipulated this way, we are not totally passive victims. We have to fight back and talk back. And there are several ways. One is to support and seek out alternative media, that which is promulgated by local politically alternative organizations here, and national alternative media, which is small and sometimes hard to locate because it doesn't have millions of dollars to circulate and distribute and publicize its stuff, like the Progressive, The Nation, In These Times, People's Daily World, these various other kinds of publications, Monthly Review. A second thing we have to do is talk back and fight back to the existing mainstream media, and that you do by writing letters and calling in and telling them they're liars. By the way, I take cognizance of these calls. They may not put you on the air, but they hear them. They may not print your letter, but they read it. So we have to talk back and fight back. I write letters all the time, and I see it as a political act. I mean, I know people have said to me, I saw your letter, I saw this and that. And I've gotten, I mean, it's not easy. In the last 10 years, I've gotten 7 things into the New York Times. Two articles, opinion page articles, and then about 5 letters. In the last 5 years, I've gotten 3 things into the Washington Post. But you keep doing that, you see. You keep pushing and nailing them and calling them to account on these things. So you talk back and fight back. A third thing is we must keep organizing. There are alternative networking. With a complete blackout and suppression by the media, the peace forces, the democratic forces in this society got 1 million people into New York in June of 1982. Was that the nuclear freeze or 81? 81, June of 81. June 12th, 82? She says 82, he says 81. 82, I hear 83, 84. Okay. And that was done through church newsletters, community newsletters, labor newspapers, and things of that sort, so that there is an alternative network. And fourth, as those democratic forces mobilize, they create a climate of opinion which sometimes does break through and force its way into the media, you see. The years of struggle around the issue of South Africa finally brought a breakthrough last year. For 30 years, the story of South Africa was suppressed. And by the way, the major story is still suppressed. It's still being treated as a civil rights struggle. You're told about the humiliation of past laws and segregation and apartheid, meaning people being kept separate and apart. Brothers and sisters, that ain't half of it. Apartheid has very little to do with past laws and the indignity and humiliation of it. Apartheid has to do with taking whole populations and bringing them out to starvation sites and watching your baby die. Apartheid is the brutal exploitation of black labor in the mines. Apartheid is throwing people out the jail windows who raise their voices up against this and beating them to death and killing them. Apartheid is killing now 15 to 20 people a day. That's with violent acts. Who knows how many systemically through all these other oppressions. Apartheid is 50% of all the Bantu and black children in South Africa die before the age of 5 from malnutrition. That's what apartheid is about. Apartheid is incredible profits to the multinational corporations and banks in South Africa. It's profit off the labor of those people, off the sweat and blood of those people. That's what the struggle is about. It's not a civil rights issue. So even when the media finally does become cognizant of it, they dare not get into that class oppression and class struggle of it. But that fight did break through. And I can tell you, 30 years ago, I wrote a paper. I was a graduate student at Brown University, getting my MA at Brown. And I wrote a paper under Professor Whitney Perkins about this thing called apartheid. Most people had never even heard of it at the time. And all I heard then was it's on its way out, it's a harebrained scheme, and the gradual change will come and it'll all get better. Well, that didn't happen. 30 years, how long do you wait for this gradual change? And all it did was get worse and worse until the democratic forces in South Africa moved with their massive boycotts and their general strikes and their fightbacks. And that sort of thing, breaking out, and the world opinion got shaken. And in the United States, black leadership picked it up, and whites, and trade union leaders. I lived in Washington, D.C., and we'd get down there in front of that embassy and march and get arrested. And the days that the unions came, our numbers went from 300 and 400 from our peace groups and our church groups and all. With the unions coming in, we'd have 2,000 and 3,000 in front of that embassy. I'm talking about unions. I'm talking about Yahoo, redneck unions from Maryland, plumbers, and guys like that, saying, "God damn, we don't want that apartheid." I couldn't believe it. It was amazing. The Maritime Union coming in with their jackets on. These are Americans, whites and blacks, together, because they don't want to compete with slave labor, and they don't want to see labor enslaved anywhere, because wherever labor is enslaved, it will also enslave you in some way. It will come at a cost to you and a danger to your interests also. And also they just don't want to see other people suffering and dying. That story does break through and it finally gets into the media. So you see, they're not totally impermeable. They have to respond to the limits of actuality. It's not a total manipulation. The limits of actuality are the limits of propaganda itself, as Joseph Goebbels discovered when he would announce victory after victory by the invincible German armies, and yet had trouble explaining why the Germans were retreating on two fronts, east and west, you see. That the limits of actuality was that was encountered in the Vietnam War, when we said, this is a war for democracy, this is a war that all Americans ought to get behind and all that. And it went on and on and on. And stories came back about villages being burned and children being executed. And Americans at home were tearing up the place and getting arrested and putting themselves in front of buses, as some of us in this room happened. And we began to wonder about the democratic process, and began to wonder about the nature of this war. And other Americans began to see these people doing this and saying, what's going on? If this is such a great war, why are hundreds of thousands of people here turning against? And the media all the while was just saying, well, we're seeing the light at the end of the tunnel, and it's coming along, or maybe we're relying a little bit too much on military solutions. Senator, do you think that might be it? And all that thing. But meanwhile, the actuality was that war went on, and eventually the media itself began to take a critical tone. As the country began to turn against that war, this opinion permeated into the major media, and they could feel freer and freer to talk about the negative aspects of that war. One of the things the media has to do, besides lie and suppress and frame and bend and mute reality for the few, is also produce a mass product called the news for the many. And that's a hard thing, because while they're owned by the few and are an instrument of the few, they also have to deal with the mass of people. So they have to constantly deal with what Gramsci called the double consciousness in people's mind. The great Italian communist Antonio Gramsci talked about the dual consciousness, it was his term. One is the consciousness we're fed, the one we get in our schools and from our media, the propaganda that comes down to us, and all those other communists are horrible, this is going to happen, they'll get your mama, this and that, we need the guns, defense will make us safe, more missiles will make us safer, and all sort of thing. That's the one consciousness. The second consciousness is the one we have from our own experience in everyday life, which tells us that something is out of sync, that this isn't right. And we ask certain questions. Why am I being taxed so much? Why does it cost the Navy $511 for an electric bulb? Why must my son register for the draft? Why are they closing down this factory? Why do things cost so much? Why are we in Vietnam, El Salvador, Nicaragua, name the country? Why are we there? Why do we need this? Why do we need that? Why are there these dioxin dumps? Why did people over in that community all get sick and have these birth defects? Why do the companies dump and turn the river into an open sewer? What's going on? Those are questions which then the media has to deal with, even if only to mute or deflect, but in the process of dealing with, often having to treat information which becomes very embarrassing to the ruling elites, which is why the right wing is constantly attacking the media as suffering from a liberal bias. The ruling elites in this country do not realize what a great job the media do in protecting their interests. To protect their interests, to protect and legitimate the status quo, the mass media must have a certain legitimacy and credibility among the public. To have a legitimacy and credibility among the public, they must deal to some degree with the reality, that second part of your dual consciousness that you deal with. To deal with that, they must at times make actual concessions to that reality to make it believable. So you got this thing, in every institution which has some kind of relative autonomy from the ruling class, there is always this problem. The law is a ruling class law, but to maintain its credibility, it's got to give the pretense of treating the rich and poor alike, or occasionally letting these guys win a case, or keeping the jury system, which they'd like to junk, because they could have all these reactionary judges make the decisions, so forth. So democratic forces have won victories. We do mobilize. We do set new standards which restrain them. And we do fight back. And that's what we must continue to do, is fight back, talk back, not just in the privacy of your own living room, but loud, loud. Shake the walls, ring the heavens, and bring democracy back to us. Let us learn not to be victimized by our cultures and our technology, but let us know that we are the makers of our own history. Thank you.